Beat down that smelly homeless woman. Millionaire tells his gardener to do that to a 6-year-old homeless girl, but the gardener does something much worse that shocked everyone. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The sun hadn't yet risen over the town of Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, when Marindia Souza, in her tattered clothes and tangled hair, rummaged through the trash cans in front of the opulent mansion of the Alcantaras. Her trembling fingers marked by time on the streets, searched among packaging and scraps, looking for something that could be useful or sold. Sweat trickled down her forehead despite the early morning chill, and her hands trembled not only from exertion but from the withdrawal, symptoms that were beginning to manifest. The mansion stood imposingly, its meticulously manicured gardens contrasting with the fragile figure of Marindia. At the main gate, a golden plaque gleamed with the name Alcantara Residence, reminding all passers-by of the power of the region's most influential family. The aroma of gardenias cultivated by Joe, the gardener, reached her, mixing with the bitter smell of her own reality. Theodore Alcantara, owner of the dairy empire that bore his surname, watched the scene from his veranda with growing irritation. At 57, the businessman had built his fortune with an iron fist and a heart that many said was made of stone. His eyes, always alert and hard, did not tolerate what he considered a stain on his immaculate property. "Joe!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the morning air like a whip. "Get over here immediately!" The gardener emerged silently from the back of the property. At 35, Joe carried on his broad shoulders the weight of secrets that no one suspected. His hands, calloused from working the land, hid a story that went far beyond simply tending plants. "Beat down that smelly homeless woman," ordered Theodore, his face contorted in an expression of disgust. "I don't want that scum in front of my house." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. The other employees who were beginning to arrive, for their shifts stopped tense, waiting for Joe's customary reaction of subservience, but something different happened that morning. Joe walked slowly to the gate, his steps firm and decisive, contradicting his usual submissive posture. As he approached Marindia, instead of obeying Theodore's order, he extended his hand to her. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a spark of recognition crossed the woman's dulled gaze. "No," replied Joe, his voice calm but firm, echoing through the garden. "I'm not going to do that." Theodore's reaction was instantaneous. His face turned purple with rage as he descended the veranda steps in heavy strides. "What did you say?" he roared, approaching menacingly. "I said I'm not going to do it," repeated Joe, standing between Marindia and his boss. "And furthermore, I'm going to take her to my house in the back." The shock was visible on the faces of everyone present. Jane, the 50-year-old housekeeper, who had just arrived, dropped the bag she was carrying. In 15 years of working at the mansion, no one had ever witnessed such a direct demonstration of rebellion against Theodore. "You have until the end of the day," spat Theodore, trembling with anger. "Either you kick her out or both of you disappear from my property forever." Ignoring the threat, Joe gently took Marindia's arm and led her through the gardens to his modest house at the back of the property. The smell of freshly brewed coffee coming from the employee's kitchen mixed with the perfume of the garden flowers, creating a surreal atmosphere for the tense moment. In the small living room of his house, Joe helped Marindia sit in a worn armchair. Her hands trembled even more now, and her gaze wandered restlessly around the simple but organized room. On the wall, a small old picture caught the eye, a yellowed photo of a classroom with a smiling young teacher in the center. "Teacher Marindia," whispered Joe, his voice filled with emotion. "You don't recognize me, but I've never forgotten." Her eyes, previously unfocused, fixed on the gardener's face with a flash of lucidity. For a moment, she seemed about to say something, but was interrupted by a strong fit of tremors. Joe quickly fetched a glass of water and a blanket, while listening to Theodore's furious footsteps still echoing around the property. Outside, Jane watched the scene from the main kitchen window, her heart divided between fear of the consequences and an inexplicable feeling that she was witnessing the beginning of something much bigger. She didn't know it, but that morning would mark the beginning of a story that would forever change the lives of everyone in that mansion. In the house in the back, Joe carefully helped Marindia settle in, aware that his actions that morning were just the first step of a much more complex journey. In his mind, memories of a classroom from 25 years ago mingled with the present as he watched his former teacher, now a shadow of the woman who had once changed his life. The sun was finally beginning to rise over Willow Creek, its first golden lights touching the gardens of the Alcantara mansion. It was the dawn of a new day, but also of a story that no one on that property could predict. And while Theodore fumed with rage in his office, Joe kept a notebook hidden in an old vase in his room, containing secrets capable of shaking the foundations of the Alcantara empire. The small house at the back of the Alcantara mansion became a makeshift refuge on that tense morning. Joe watched Marindia sleeping restlessly on the couch after finally succumbing to exhaustion. Her hands, still trembling even in her sleep, clung to the old blanket he had provided. Her face, marked by time and suffering, occasionally twitched, as if even in dreams she could not find peace. The gardener took advantage of this moment of calm to examine his precious notebook, carefully removed from the old vase where he kept it hidden. The pages were yellowed, and some edges were already beginning to crumble, but the meticulous notes remained clear. Dates, amounts, names, and detailed diagrams of Theodore Alcantara's shady dealings. For years, Joe had recorded every whispered conversation, every carelessly discarded document, every suspicious meeting he had witnessed while silently tending the gardens. His thoughts were interrupted by discreet knocks on the back door. It was Jane, the housekeeper, carrying a tray with coffee, bread, and some medications. Her dark eyes, always watchful, examined the situation with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "How is she?" she asked in a low voice, placing the tray on the simple kitchen table. "The boss is a beast. I've never seen him so distraught. He's already called 3 different lawyers this morning." Joe quickly put away the notebook and helped Jane with the tray. "She needs medical attention," he replied, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of concern. "The withdrawal is going to get worse, and I don't know if I'm prepared to deal with it alone." Jane approached the sleeping Marindia, adjusting the blanket with a motherly care. Her nearly 20 years working at the mansion had given her a sixth sense for trouble, and something about this situation deeply stirred her. "There's something more here, isn't there, Joe? You've never defied the boss before, not even when he humiliated your sister at the Christmas party last year." The gardener hesitated, his eyes turning to the old photo on the wall. "She was my teacher, Jane, back when everyone thought I had some kind of mental problem, that I was slow. She was the only one who believed in me, who realized that I just needed a little more attention, someone who had the patience to teach me." The housekeeper sat down, absorbing the information. Her more than 50 years of life had taught her to recognize when a story was just beginning to unfold. And what happened to her? How did she end up like this? Before Joe could answer, a sharp scream cut through the air. Marindia had woken up and was having a violent withdrawal fit. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, and she began knocking over objects around her, seized by a frenzied agitation. "No, no, no, Liz! Where's my Liz?" she screamed, her eyes wide with panic. "They took her. Raymond said he'd protect her. Raymond promised." The name struck Joe and Jane like lightning. Raymond had been the mansion's former caretaker, Joe's best friend, who had mysteriously disappeared 6 years ago. His mention made Jane pale, remembering the never-clarified circumstances of his disappearance. Amidst the confusion, Marindia knocked over the old vase where Joe kept his notebook. The object shattered on the floor, scattering shards and papers. Jane, acting quickly, began to collect the fragments when her eyes caught some of the exposed notes. "Joe," she whispered, holding one of the pages with trembling hands. "Is this what I think it is?" But there was no time for explanations. Marindia, in her desperation, clung to Joe's shirt, her face contorted in an expression of deep anguish. "My daughter, Liz. She's only 6 years old. They took her to the shelter. They said I couldn't take care of her anymore. But she's my girl!" The revelation fell like a bomb in the small room. Jane dropped the paper she was holding, bringing her hands to her mouth. "Daughter? With Raymond?" At that moment, heavy footsteps were heard outside. Theodore was coming, accompanied by 2 men in suits, probably the lawyers he had called. Joe quickly gathered the scattered papers, while Jane tried to calm Marindia. "Listen to me carefully," said Jane quickly, her voice taking on a tone of urgency. "I'll distract them. Joe, take her to the tool shed and keep her quiet. And as for this," she pointed to the papers in her. "Enzwili, we need to talk later. I think I know more about Raymond's disappearance than I thought." As Jane went out to intercept Theodore, Joe guided the trembling Marindia to the shed at the back of the garden. The space was cramped and dark, but offered a temporary hiding place. There, among gardening tools and bags of fertilizer, he held his former teacher's hands, trying to calm her down. "Teacher Marindia, I need you to trust me now, as I trusted you so many years ago," he whispered. "I'm going to help you recover and find your daughter. But first, I need to know, what happened to Raymond?" Her eyes, previously unfocused, met Joe's with a momentary clarity. He found out something terrible about Theodore. He said he was going to report it, that he could no longer live with it on his conscience. "The next night, he disappeared. 3 months later, I lost my house in the fire and everything fell apart. Alcohol was the only thing I had left." Outside, they could hear Theodore's authoritarian voice arguing with Jane. The sound of footsteps was approaching the garden, and Joe knew they needed to remain absolutely silent. But his mind worked frantically, connecting dots that had intrigued him for years. Raymond's disappearance, the suspicious fire at Marindia's house, the little Liz in some shelter in the city, and Theodore Alcantara's dark secrets documented. In his notebook, everything was beginning to form a larger and more sinister picture than he could have imagined. In his shirt pocket, a piece of paper from the notebook had survived the fall of the vase. On it, a specific note caught his attention. "Monthly payments, Santa Clara Asylum, neighboring city, patient R." Joe felt a chill run down his spine. Could it be possible that after all these years? Theodore's voice sounded closer and closer, and the cramped space of the shed seemed to shrink with each passing second. Marindia began to tremble again, and Joe could feel that a new crisis was approaching. He knew that in the coming hours he would need to make decisions that would forever change the course of their lives. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, Magnolia, Theodore's wife, was watching all the movement from her window on the 2nd floor, her eyes revealing a peculiar interest in the situation. Afternoon fell over Willow Creek as Magnolia, Alcantara, from her observation post on the 2nd floor of the mansion, followed the movement in the gardens with an interest that went beyond mere curiosity. Her long and elegant fingers, adorned with expensive rings that seemed more like golden shackles, drummed nervously on the windowsill. At 45, her fragile and refined appearance hid a sharp and observant mind that had for years recorded every detail of her husband's tyranny. In the tool shed, Joe and Marindia remained hidden, their hearts beating fast with each approaching footstep. The cramped space was filled with the smell of wet earth and fertilizers, and the afternoon heat transformed the place into a small greenhouse. Marindia struggled silently against a new wave of tremors, biting her lips almost until they bled to contain the groans of discomfort. "They've searched everywhere, sir." The voice of Asdrubal, the family driver, sounded close by. "No sign of them in the garden or on the grounds in the back." "Incompetent," thundered Theodore. "How is it possible that no one saw where that insolent gardener took that beggar?" Jane maintained her firm posture in the face of the boss's fury, years of experience allowing her to sustain a neutral expression even when her heart was racing. "Sir, if you allow me to suggest, perhaps they have left the property. I saw movement in the back, near the service gate." The lie came naturally. From her lips, a small disobedience that carried the weight of years of witnessing Theodore's cruelties. Her thoughts returned constantly to that night 6 years ago when she found Raymond in a state of extreme agitation in the back kitchen. Flashback. "Jane, I need to tell you something," he had said, his hands trembling as he held a cup of coffee. "I've discovered something terrible about the boss, something that could destroy everything he's built." "For God's sake, Raymond, speak lower," had whispered to her, hastily closing the kitchen door. "The abandoned mine. You can't imagine what he hid there. And the falsified product reports, the people who are getting sick. I can't carry this weight anymore." The next morning, Raymond had disappeared, leaving only unanswered questions and a heavy silence that lingered to this day. End of flashback. The sound of breaking glass snapped Jane out of her memories. In the shed, Marindia had knocked over a small vase, and the noise, though faint, was enough to attract everyone's attention. "What was that?" asked Theodore, his eyes flashing with suspicion. "Must be the cats," replied Jane promptly. "They're always getting into the shed after the mice." But Theodore was already heading towards the spot, his determined steps crunching on the gravel of the garden path. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. Magnolia appeared in the garden, her elegant figure descending the veranda steps with a studied grace. "Theodore, darling," her melodious voice cut through the tense air like silk over steel. "The representative from the Dairy Producers Association is on the phone. Says it's urgent, something about the new sanitation regulations." The businessman stopped in his tracks, his face contracting into an expression of annoyance. The mention of sanitation regulations always made him particularly nervous, and all the employees knew why. The company's questionable production methods were an open secret among the older employees. "Damn it!" he cursed, spinning on his heels. "Asdrubal keeps searching. And you, Jane, you're hiding something from me, I know it. Be careful, very careful with your choices." As Theodore walked away, followed closely by his lawyers, Magnolia remained in the garden for a moment longer than necessary. Her eyes swept over the tool shed with an enigmatic expression before returning to the mansion in slow, measured steps. Inside the shed, Marindia had begun to sweat profusely, her body entering an increasingly severe state of withdrawal. Joe held her hands, trying to keep her calm and conscious. "Liz," she murmured repeatedly. "My little Liz. She has her father's eyes, you know, the same eyes as Raymond, deep and kind." Joe felt his heart clench. He remembered Raymond talking about a woman he loved but had never connected the dots. His friend had always been reserved about his personal life, especially in the last months before his disappearance. When night finally fell and silence took over the property, Jane managed to take Marindia back to the house in the back. The place was a mess after the search ordered by Theodore, but at least it offered more comfort than the tool shed. "We need to act fast," said Jane, preparing a tea with the herbs she always carried with her. "Theodore won't give up easily, and Marindia needs urgent medical help." Joe nodded, taking out his notebook from a new hiding place he had improvised. "I have enough information here to destroy Theodore," he said, flipping through the densely filled pages. Dairy product tampering, tax evasion, bribery of inspectors, but the most important thing might be this. He showed the note about the payments to Santa Clara Asylum. Jane paled as she read the name of the place. Santa Clara, it's less than 2 hours from here, she murmured, and this patient arm. Could be Raymond, completed Joe, but we need to be sure before we act. And we also need to find a way to help Marindia recover and locate little Liz. At that moment, soft knocks sounded on the back door. Joe and Jane exchanged apprehensive glances. To their surprise, when they opened it, they found Magnolia Alcantara. Theodore's wife entered silently, her movements gracefully controlled as always, but there was something different in her eyes, a determination that neither of them had seen before. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "I know about the notebook, Joe. I know about the notes, about Theodore's crimes, and I know about Raymond." Jane held her breath, while Joe instinctively placed himself between Magnolia and Marindia, who was sleeping restlessly on the couch. "How?" he asked, tense. "Because I also keep secrets," replied Magnolia, raising the sleeve of her elegant dress to reveal purple marks on her wrist. "And because I'm tired of being a prisoner in my own home, I want to help, but we need to act intelligently. Theodore is dangerous when cornered." Outside, the wind began to blow harder, swaying the leaves of the garden trees. The night promised to be long, and the revelations were just beginning. On the couch, Marindia murmured in her restless sleep, calling for Liz and Raymond, her fingers clutching the blanket as if trying to hold onto the broken pieces of her life. And in the main mansion, Theodore Alcantara made frantic calls, mobilizing. His contacts determined to crush any threat to his empire. What he didn't know was that, for the first time in his life, he faced adversaries who would not bow to his power. People moved not by money or ambition, but by a deep sense of justice, and by the strength of the bonds that united them. The early morning hours advanced slowly in Willow Creek, bringing with it a dense fog that covered the gardens of the Alcantara mansion like a protective cloak. In the small house at the back, Magnolia, Joe, and Jane formed a makeshift circle around the kitchen table, their voices kept in whispers, while Marindia finally managed to sleep in the next room after hours of tremors and anguish. "My marriage to Theodore has always been a gilded cage," began Magnolia, her elegant hands wrapping around a cup of tea that had cooled without being touched. "In the beginning, I mistook his controlling behavior for protection, his obsession with power for ambition. When I realized the truth, it was already too late. The weak light of the single kitchen lamp cast restless shadows over their tense faces. Jane attentively watched her employer, noticing for the first time the small emotional scars that years of living with Theodore had left. The slight tremor in her hands when she heard louder footsteps, the way her eyes instinctively sought escape, roots in any environment. 15 years ago, continued Magnolia, her voice gaining firmness, I discovered the first signs of Theodore's shady dealings. It started with small irregularities in the dairy company, altering expiration dates, reusing expired products, adulterating the milk's composition. When I tried to confront him, I met his true face. She raised her dress sleeve again, revealing more marks besides those she had already shown. Every time I threatened to report him, he found a new way to silence me. Threats against my family, against my friends, against anyone who could offer me help. Joe absorbed every word, his notebook open on the table, pages and pages of meticulous notes that now took on new meaning with Magnolia's revelations. "What about Raymond?" he asked, his voice betraying the anxiety he felt. "What do you know?" "About his disappearance." Magnolia's eyes filled with contained tears. Raymond was more than just an employee. He was the only one who realized the hell I was living in. On the nights when Theodore lost control, it was Raymond who discreetly Left ice and ointments in my room. He started investigating Theodore for my sake, you know. He wanted to gather enough evidence to help me escape. In the next room, they heard Marindia stir restlessly, mumbling incoherent words. Jane rose silently to check on her returning. Moments later, with a worried expression, "The fever is rising," she reported. "We need medical help, and soon. The withdrawal is getting more and more severe." Magnolia nodded, taking an envelope from her bag. "I have a secret bank account that I've kept for years, saving small amounts that Theodore doesn't realize are missing. It's not much, but it should be enough to get us started." Joe flipped through his notebook, stopping at a specific page. "Here," he pointed. 3 months before he disappeared, Raymond started making notes about the abandoned mine on Theodore's land. There are records of secret meetings, nighttime deliveries, and something about toxic waste. "The mine," whispered Magnolia, her face paling. "Theodore bought that land for next to nothing 10 years ago. The former owner was desperate to sell, something about soil contamination. At the time, I thought it was strange that Theodore was interested in a seemingly worthless property." Jane, who had been listening silently until then, leaned over the table. "Remember the epidemic of health problems that affected the Bella Vista neighborhood 5 years ago? Dozens of people with mysterious symptoms, mainly children. The neighborhood is located exactly below the mine area." A noise coming from the room interrupted the conversation. Marindia had woken up and was calling for someone. Joe ran to attend to her, finding her sitting on the bed, her eyes more lucid than they had been all day. "Liz," she said, grabbing Joe's arm. "I need to tell you about Liz. She's at the St. Anthony's shelter, right here in Willow Creek. I lost my house in the fire. I tried to protect her. I swear I tried. But without Raymond, without a place to live, with alcohol taking over me, they said it was for her own good." Tears streamed down her face, marked by suffering. "She's only 6 years old, you know? So small, so much like her father. Raymond barely had time to get to know her properly before." Her voice failed, and a new wave of tremors took over her body. Joe held her hands, trying to convey some comfort, while Jane ran to prepare more tea with her herbs. Magnolia watched the scene from the door, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "My sister Olivia works in social services," she said. "Maybe she can help us find out more about Liz's situation at the shelter." "No!" Marindia's voice came out as a muffled scream. "No one can know! If Theodore finds out about Liz, if he knows she's Raymond's daughter—" "Why?" asked Joe, sensing that they were about to discover another piece of the puzzle. What did Raymond discover that was so serious? Marindia closed her eyes tightly, as if the memory was too painful. "The last time I saw him, he was agitated, different. He said he had proof, documents that could destroy Theodore. Something about the mine, about intentional contamination. He said that Theodore was using the dairy company to illegally dispose of toxic waste, poisoning the region's water table." A heavy silence fell over the room. Joe felt his heart race as he realized the gravity of the situation. If Raymond really had proof— "The documents," murmured Marindia, her voice weak. "He hid them, said it was the only place Theodore would never look." Before she could complete the sentence, her body was seized by a violent convulsion. Jane and Magnolia ran to help, while Joe, helpless, watched his former teacher fight against the demons of withdrawal. Outside, the first rays of sun were beginning to paint the sky pink, announcing a new day. In the main mansion, lights were turned on in Theodore's rooms. He always woke up before dawn to check the company's reports. "We need to act fast," said Magnolia, her voice full of urgency. "I know a discreet rehab clinic in a neighboring town. I can arrange for Marindia to be admitted today, before Theodore realizes my involvement." "What about Liz?" asked Jane, changing the compresses on Marindia's forehead. "One step at a time," replied Joe, his mind working frantically. "First, we need to make sure Marindia receives treatment. Then, we'll investigate the Santa Clara Asylum. If Raymond really is there, he may be our key to finding the evidence and protecting Liz. The sound of a car being started in the mansion's garage alerted them. Theodore was leaving for his morning routine at the company. For a few moments, everyone remained in tense silence until the engine noise disappeared into the distance. "There's one more thing," said Magnolia, her voice low but firm. "Theodore has a sister, Olivia. They haven't spoken in over a decade due to a family feud, but she has influence in the area of social services. If we can get her help—" "We can't trust anyone in his family," interrupted Jane. "Olivia is different," insisted Magnolia. "She always saw through her brother's facade. That's why they drifted apart. She refused to turn a blind eye to his shady dealings." At that moment, Marindia opened her eyes again, her voice surprisingly clear. "In the chest, behind the altar, St. Sebastian's church." And then she fainted, leaving everyone in suspense. Joe and Jane exchanged meaningful glances. St. Sebastian's church was where Raymond used to spend hours praying in the last days before his disappearance. The morning was advancing rapidly, and decisions needed to be made. The plan was beginning to take shape. Magnolia would arrange for Marindia's admission to rehab, Joe would investigate the lead at the church, and Jane would keep an eye out for any suspicious movements by Theodore. What none of them knew was that, at that very moment, a brown envelope was being delivered to the mansion's gatehouse, addressed to Theodore Alcantara, containing information that would completely change the course of events. The sender, Santa Clara Asylum. The sun was already high when Asdrubal, the driver, delivered the brown envelope into the hands of Theodore Alcantara. The businessman was in his office, an imposing room decorated with solid wood furniture and a privileged view of the mansion gardens. His thick fingers tore open the envelope with impatience, and his eyes quickly scanned the contents of the document. As he read, his face took on an increasingly purple color. "Incompetent!" he roared, slamming his fist on the mahogany desk. "How did they let this happen?" The report from Santa Clara Asylum stated that patient R had shown signs of significant improvement in recent weeks. Even more worrying, he had begun to form coherent sentences during therapy sessions, repeatedly mentioning words like mine, poison, and Theodore. At the same moment, in the small house at the back, a delicate operation was unfolding. Magnolia had managed, through her discreet contacts, to arrange for Marindia to be admitted to the New Beginnings Clinic, a private and secluded establishment, 2 hours from Willow Creek. The challenge now was to transport her without attracting attention. "The fall festival starts this afternoon," commented Jane, helping Marindia dress in clean clothes that Magnolia had provided. "The town will be busy. It will be easier to go unnoticed." Marindia, more lucid after taking the medications that Magnolia had brought, held tightly to a small portrait of Liz, the only photo she had managed to keep with her during her days on the streets. In the yellowed image, a 5-year-old girl smiled, her large and expressive eyes identical to Raymond's. "Promise you'll find her," she whispered to Joe, her voice choked with emotion. "Promise you'll protect my little one if something happens to me." Joe held his former teacher's trembling hands, remembering how she had done the same for him so many years ago when no one else believed in his abilities. "I promise," he replied, his voice firm. "And I also promise that we're going to find out the truth about Raymond. You're going to recover, and we're going to reunite your family." Outside the house, sounds of music and cheerful voices began to echo. The preparations for the fall festival were in full swing. The town's traditional celebration always attracted crowds, and the Alcantara Dairy Company was the main sponsor of the event. Magnolia, who was watching from the window, saw unusual movement in Theodore's office. "Something is wrong," she murmured. "He's too agitated, making calls non-stop." Jane quietly approached the window. "Mrs. Alcantara, there's one more thing I need to tell you. Something I discovered years ago, but never had the courage to reveal. Everyone turned to the housekeeper, who took a deep breath before continuing. On the night Raymond disappeared, I saw him entering St. Sebastian's church with a folder full of documents. He was different, agitated. He said he had discovered something terrible about the contamination of the water table, that Theodore was using the dairy company as a front for a much larger scheme. "And why didn't you ever say anything?" asked Joe, his voice betraying a hint of hurt. Jane's eyes filled with contained tears. "Because the next morning I found this in my room." She took out a yellowed paper, folded several times, from her apron pocket. It was a photo of her youngest son, who lived in another city, with a clear message: "Accidents happen every day." A heavy silence fell over the group. Magnolia was the first to break it. "Theodore has always known how to use fear as a weapon, but now we are stronger together than apart." At that moment, they heard heavy footsteps approaching the house in the back. It was Asdrubal, accompanied by two unknown men in dark suits. "Quick!" whispered Magnolia. "Through the back garden!" While Jane distracted the men at the front door, Joe and Magnolia led Marindia through the narrow paths between the rose bushes that he himself had planted. His deep knowledge of the gardens now proved vital. There were almost invisible passages between the plants that few knew about. They managed to reach the car that Magnolia had strategically parked on a side street. But before they could leave, Marindia grabbed Joe's arm with surprising strength. "The chest behind the altar," she said, her eyes feverish but determined. "Raymond always said that in case of emergency, you should look there. He said he had left something that could change everything." "I'll check it out today," promised Joe. "Now you need to focus on recovering." As the car drove away, carrying Marindia and Magnolia, Joe cautiously returned to the house in the back. He found Jane alone, visibly shaken. "They're looking for documents," she informed him in a low voice. "Theodore received something that made him distraught. I heard Asdrubal commenting about a report from Santa Clara Asylum." Joe felt his heart race. If Raymond was really starting to regain his memory, time was running out. The rest of the afternoon passed in growing tension. The fall festival took over the town's streets with its colorful stalls and cultural performances, but at the Alcantara mansion, the atmosphere was one of imminent storm. Theodore convened an emergency meeting with his lawyers and confidants. From the garden, Joe could see the silhouettes moving in the office, animated gestures and altered voices occasionally reaching his ears. Taking advantage of the general distraction caused by the festival, he began to implement the first part of his plan. With the excuse of pruning the rose bushes near the office window, he positioned himself strategically to overhear the conversation. "The patient is recovering his memory," said one of the lawyers. "We need to transfer him immediately to a more controlled facility." "No!" Theodore's voice thundered. "No transfers! That would attract attention. We need a more definitive solution." The words made Joe freeze. It was clear that Theodore planned to silence Raymond permanently this time. In the middle of the afternoon, a new complication arose. Olivia Mendonça, Theodore's estranged sister, was seen entering St. Anthony's shelter. As a respected social worker in the region, her presence there would not normally attract attention, but Joe knew it couldn't be a coincidence. Jane, who maintained contact with an employee of the shelter, brought disturbing news. Olivia was interested specifically in Liz's case. "She's been asking about the girl's relatives, about the mother's whereabouts," reported Jane. "But the strangest thing is that she seemed to already know a lot about the story, as if she was just confirming information." As the sun began to set, painting the sky with orange tones, Joe made a risky decision. Taking advantage of the fact that everyone was focused on the preparations for the opening party of the new dairy factory warehouse, which would take place during the festival, He grabbed his bike and pedaled to St. Sebastian's church. The temple was practically empty at that hour. Only a few elderly ladies prayed in scattered pews. With his heart racing, Joe headed to the altar. Years of caring for the church's gardens as a volunteer gave him some freedom of movement. The chest mentioned by Marindia was there, partially hidden by a wooden panel. It was an old, heavy piece used to store liturgical vestments. With trembling hands, Joe began to inspect it. That's when he felt a presence behind him. Looking for something specific, Joe? He turned slowly. Standing a few feet away, with an envelope similar to the one Theodore had received in the morning, was Olivia Mendonça. Her eyes, so similar to her brother's but carrying a kindness he never possessed, studied the gardener attentively. "Perhaps," she said, her voice calm but firm, "it's time to join forces, because you're not the only one who's been investigating my brother in recent years." The central nave of St. Sebastian's church was bathed in the golden light of the evening that passed through the stained glass windows, creating colorful patterns on the marble floor. Joe and Olivia stared at each other in a silence charged with tension, while the last devout women left the temple, their steps echoing under the centuries-old vault. Olivia Mendonça was nothing like her brother Theodore. At 43, she had a natural elegance that did not depend on jewelry or expensive clothes. Her eyes, although the same color as her brother's, carried a genuine compassion that contrasted with his calculating coldness. "How long have you known?" asked Joe, his fingers still touching the rough surface of the chest behind the altar. Olivia approached slowly, her low heels echoing on the marble floor. "About Raymond? About Marindia? About little Liz?" She paused, her eyes fixing on Joe's. "Or about my brother's crimes?" The gardener felt a chill run down his spine. How did she know so much? Before he could answer, Olivia removed a series of documents from the envelope she was carrying. 10 years ago, when I broke off relations with Theodore, it wasn't just because of a family feud, as everyone thinks," she began, her voice maintaining a controlled tone. "It was because I discovered the first signs of his illegal activities. At the time, they were just small tax irregularities, but knowing my brother as I do, I knew it was just the tip of the iceberg." She held out some of the documents to Joe. They were detailed reports on the contamination of the water table in the area of the old mine, water analyses showing alarming levels of heavy metals and other toxic compounds. For years, I strategically kept my distance, building a solid reputation in the area of social services. This gave me access to information, to people, to stories that Theodore was desperately trying to hide. Joe flipped through the documents, his heart racing with each new revelation. "Did you know about Marindia and Liz from the beginning?" A sad smile formed on Olivia's lips. "When Liz arrived at the shelter, I immediately recognized Raymond's eyes in her. I started pulling the threads of the story, and the more I discovered, the more horrified I became by my brother's actions." At that moment, Joe's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Magnolia informing him that Marindia was safe at the rehab clinic, starting the detoxification process. "Your sister-in-law is an extraordinary woman," commented Olivia, again surprising Joe with her knowledge of the situation. "For years I've watched how she survives in that house, gathering strength and resources to one day be able to act." A noise coming from the sacristy made them both jump. It was just Father John, an elderly man who had served in the parish for decades. He cast an understanding look in their direction before discreetly withdrawing. "Father John also knows more than he lets on," revealed Olivia. "He was the one who helped Raymond hide something in this chest on the night he disappeared." Carefully, the two began to examine the inside of the old piece of furniture. In the back, under several layers of dusty vestments, they found a false compartment. Inside it, there was a flash drive, and a notebook similar to the one Joe kept, but much older and worn. "Raymond's notes," whispered Joe, flipping through the yellowed pages with reverence. The content was devastating. Raymond had meticulously documented not only the illegal toxic waste disposal scheme, but also an intricate network of bribes and blackmail that Theodore had built over the years. Even more shocking was the evidence that the contamination of the water table was not accidental. It was part of a calculated plan to devalue the properties in the region. "Theodore always knew that those lands were valuable," explained Olivia. "There are large reserves of pure mineral water in the deeper layers. By contaminating the surface water table, he managed to buy the properties for a fraction of their real value." Joe felt his stomach churn. "And the people who got sick? The children in the Bella Vista neighborhood?" "Collateral damage, in my brother's view," replied Olivia, her voice full of bitterness. "But Raymond discovered all of this, and when he confronted Theodore, he was poisoned little by little," completed Joe, remembering the information about patient R at Santa Clara Asylum. "Theodore must have used the mine's own contaminants." A sound of bells cut through the air. It was 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and the fall festival was in full swing on the streets of the town. Through the church windows, they could hear the music and joy of the celebration, a cruel contrast to the dark revelations they were uncovering. "We need to act fast," said Olivia, carefully guarding the documents. "Theodore received the report from the asylum this morning. Knowing my brother, he must already be planning to silence Raymond permanently." "What about Liz?" asked Joe, his concern evident. "She's safe in the shelter for now. As the social worker responsible for the case, I made sure that no one can remove her without my express authorization." Olivia paused, her eyes softening. "She's an extraordinary child, you know, so intelligent, so sensitive, just like her father." At that moment, Joe's cell phone vibrated again. It was an urgent message from Jane. "Theodore just left with Asdrubal, and 2 men I've never seen before. I overheard something about visiting a patient." The blood froze in Joe's veins. "They're going to Santa Clara Asylum," he said, his heart pounding. "They're going to try to do something to Raymond today." Olivia was already grabbing her keys. "I'll go ahead. I have free access to the asylum because of my work. You and Jane find Magnolia and meet us there. And Joe," she hesitated at the church door, "take the evidence you've gathered all these years. It's time to end my brother's reign of terror." As he ran back to the mansion, Joe felt the weight of the story he carried. In his pocket, Raymond's flash drive and notebook seemed to burn, loaded with truths that could finally bring justice. At the rehab clinic, Marindia fought against the symptoms of withdrawal. Her silent prayers divided between the daughter she could not see and the man she loved, trapped in a world of fog and confusion. And somewhere on the road to Santa Clara Asylum, Theodore Alcantara followed in his luxurious car, his thoughts occupied with dark plans that he would not hesitate to execute to protect his empire. The sun set on the horizon of Willow Creek, painting the sky with shades of red that seemed like a harbinger of what was to come. The fall festival continued lively on the town's streets, its inhabitants oblivious to the drama that was unfolding in the shadows of their everyday lives. At the mansion, Joe found Jane anxiously waiting in the back. The housekeeper had separated a folder with copies of documents that she herself had accumulated over the years. Suspicious receipts, overheard conversations, small pieces of evidence. That, added to the others, formed a devastating picture of corruption and cruelty. "Magnolia called," she informed him, as the two hurried to Joe's old car. "She's leaving the clinic now. Said that Marindia had a moment of lucidity and revealed one more thing. There was a letter hidden along with the documents in the chest, a letter addressed to Liz." Joe's cell phone vibrated once again. It was Olivia. "I've arrived at the Asylum. Theodore isn't here yet, but something is wrong. Patient R's file has disappeared from the system. Hurry! Night was beginning to fall over Willow Creek, and with it, the feeling that events long in motion were finally reaching their decisive moment. In the growing darkness, a gardener, a housekeeper, a social worker, and the wife of a powerful businessman prepared to face long-buried truths, motivated not by revenge, but by justice and by love for the people Theodore had tried to destroy. Night fell over Santa Clara Asylum, a complex of white buildings surrounded by well-kept gardens in the neighboring town to Willow Creek. The air carried the characteristic aroma of cleaning products mixed with the fragrance of night blooming. Jasmine that flourished in the flower beds, in the silent corridors. Only the distant echo of footsteps and the soft hum of fluorescent lamps broke the quiet of the evening. Olivia Mendonça walked briskly through the corridors, her determined steps contrasting with the lethargic atmosphere of the place. As a respected social worker, her presence there did not raise suspicions, but her heart beat fast with the urgency of the situation. She had just discovered that patient R's file had mysteriously disappeared from the system, and her attempts to locate Raymond through the staff were met with confused looks and evasive answers. On the 4th floor, East Wing, she finally found Sandra, a nurse who had worked at the asylum for more than 2 decades and who, over the years, had become her discreet informant. "Something is very wrong," whispered Sandra, pulling Olivia into an empty hallway. There was an emergency transfer order for the patient in 408. The documentation seemed official, but the procedure was completely irregular. "They're preparing him for removal tonight." "Who signed the order?" asked Olivia, although she already suspected the answer. "Dr. Alberto Mendez," replied Sandra, her eyes revealing concern. "That same doctor who appears whenever your brother needs special favors." Olivia felt a tightness in her chest. Dr. Alberto was known to participate in Theodore's schemes, providing false reports and manipulating medical records when necessary. His presence in this situation could only mean that her brother was planning something terrible. Meanwhile, on the road that connected Willow Creek to the asylum, Joe drove his old car as fast as he could, with Jane by his side, constantly checking her cell phone for updates. In the back seat, Magnolia remained in tense silence, her usual elegance marred by the obvious worry on her face. "How's Marindia?" asked Jane, trying to fill the agonizing silence of the trip. "Starting treatment," replied Magnolia, her soft voice carrying a note of hope. "The doctors say the process will be difficult, but she has surprising inner strength. Before I left, she managed to tell me more about the night Raymond disappeared." Joe adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Magnolia's. "What did she say?" "Apparently, Raymond had created an elaborate system to protect the evidence he gathered," explained Magnolia. "He didn't keep everything in one place. The letter to Liz, for example, contains crucial information about the location of other documents. He knew he was being followed, so he divided the evidence into several parts, like a puzzle," murmured Jane, understanding the strategy. "Exactly," confirmed Magnolia. "Marindia said that on the night he disappeared, he was agitated, different. He said something about having discovered the final piece of Theodore's scheme. Something so serious that it would change everything." The car shook as it passed over a bumpy stretch of road, and Joe had to slow down. His mind worked frantically, connecting the dots. The notebook found in the church chest, the notes about the mine, the suspicious payments, the gradual poisoning. "The contamination wasn't just to devalue the lands," he said, a sudden realization hitting him. "It was an experiment." "What do you mean?" asked Jane and Magnolia simultaneously. "In the last records in my notebook, there are notes about secret meetings of Theodore with representatives of a foreign company," explained Joe. "At the time, I couldn't understand completely, but now he was testing a new method of ore extraction. using highly toxic chemicals. The contaminated milk, distributed mainly in the Bella Vista neighborhood, was a way to study the long-term effects. The horror of the revelation fell heavily on the occupants of the car. Magnolia brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. So the people in that neighborhood, the children, they were guinea pigs, completed Jane, her voice trembling with anger, and Raymond discovered all of this. At that moment, Magnolia's cell phone rang. It was Olivia, her voice urgent through the phone. "They're preparing Raymond for transfer. Dr. Alberto is here. Theodore should arrive any minute. We need to act now." Joe accelerated the car, ignoring the protests of the aging engine. In the bag beside him, Raymond's flash drive and notebook seemed to weigh a ton, loaded with truths that could destroy the empire Theodore built on the suffering of innocence. At the asylum, Olivia had gained access to room 408 thanks to Sandra's help. Raymond was sitting on his bed, dressed in travel clothes, his lost gaze focused on the window. 6 years of confinement and heavy medication had left deep marks, but something in his eyes still held the kindness that Marindia loved so much. "Raymond," called Olivia softly, approaching carefully, "do you recognize me?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes taking time to focus. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "The good sister." Her heart leaped. It was the first time in years that he had shown clear recognition of her. "Yes, it's me. We've come to help you. Marindia, Joe, we're all here." Upon hearing Marindia's name, Raymond's eyes filled with tears. "Liz," he murmured, "my girl, you have to protect." Footsteps in the hallway interrupted the moment. Dr. Alberto entered the room, accompanied by 2 intimidating-looking nurses that Olivia had never seen before. "Ms. Mendonça," said the doctor, his voice falsely cordial. "I didn't expect to find you here at this hour." "I was making a routine visit," she replied, maintaining her composure. "As the social worker responsible for several cases, I have that prerogative." Of course," he smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But I'm afraid you'll have to excuse us now. We have an urgent transfer to carry out." At that exact moment, a commotion broke out in the hallway. Raised voices and hurried footsteps echoed through the asylum corridors. Sandra burst into the room, breathless. "Dr. Alberto, there's been an accident at the entrance." A car skidded and crashed into the main gate. It was the signal Olivia had been waiting for. She knew that Joe, Jane, and Magnolia had arrived and were putting their plan into action. The supposed accident would be a distraction to buy time. While the doctor and the nurses were distracted by the confusion, Olivia quickly approached Raymond. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. "Do you trust me?" Raymond stared at her, and for a moment she saw a glimpse of the man he used to be, determined and courageous. "The letter," he murmured. "Liz needs..." "The letter explains everything." In the hallway, they could hear more voices approaching. One of them, authoritative and familiar, made Olivia freeze. Theodore had arrived. The decisive moment was near, and the next actions would determine not only Raymond's fate, but that of all those involved in that plot of secrets and injustices. The night advanced over Santa Clara Asylum, and in the gardens outside, the night-blooming jasmine continued to flourish, oblivious to the drama that unfolded in its silent corridors. Somewhere in the town, a 6-year-old girl slept in her bed. At the shelter, unaware that her life was about to change forever, the corridors of Santa Clara Asylum transformed into a labyrinth of tension and urgency. The sound of Theodore's footsteps echoed through the tiled floors, approaching inexorably towards room 408. Olivia, still beside Raymond, felt her heart hammering against her chest as she tried to formulate an escape plan. Sandra, the nurse, returned to the room hurriedly. "He brought more men," she whispered, closing the door silently behind her. "They're blocking all the exits on the floor." Outside the asylum, the supposed accident at the main gate had created the planned distraction. Joe, who had purposely crashed his old car into the entrance gate, gestured animatedly with the security guards, prolonging the confusion. Jane and Magnolia had managed to enter discreetly during the tumult, using the social worker badge that Olivia had provided. "We need to get Raymond out of here," said Magnolia, finding Olivia in the hallway adjacent to the room. Her years living with Theodore had taught her to recognize the signs of imminent danger. "My husband didn't come here just for a transfer." Raymond, sitting on the edge of the bed, seemed to fight against the fog of medications in his mind. His eyes, previously unfocused, now showed an increasing lucidity, as if the presence of familiar faces was helping him emerge from his lethargic state. "The mine," he murmured, his hoarse voice firmer than before. "The tests. The children of Bella. Vista, Theodore used everyone as guinea pigs," completed Jane, who had just entered the room. "We know, Raymond. We found your notes, the flash drive, everything you hid in the church." A glimmer of recognition crossed Raymond's marked face. "But not everything," he said, raising his trembling hand to his chest. "The most important part, the final proof." Before he could continue, raised voices in the hallway alerted them. Theodore had arrived on the floor, and his voice carried that authoritative tone that everyone knew so well. "Dr. Alberto," he thundered, "I want that transfer carried out immediately. And I want to know why the hell my sister is in the building." Olivia acted quickly. "Sandra, do you know any alternative routes? Any way to get out of here without using the main corridors?" The nurse hesitated for a moment. Then her eyes lit up. "The service staircase. There's an entrance through the supply closet at the end of the hall. The staff uses it to transport supplies. It leads directly to the basement, where the laundries are." Magnolia was already in action, her experience in planning secret escapes from her own house finally being useful. "Jane, go find Joe. Tell him to move the car to the service entrance. At the back of the building. Sandra, we need extra clothes, something that can disguise Raymond." While the others moved, Olivia remained with Raymond, helping him to stand up. His muscles, weakened by years of inactivity, responded slowly, but there was a growing determination in his movements. "Marindia," he whispered, holding Olivia's arm. "How is she?" "In treatment," replied Olivia softly. "She's fighting to recover, for you and for Liz." The name of his daughter seemed to awaken something deep in Raymond. His back straightened slightly, and his eyes gained a new focus. "The letter," he said with renewed urgency. "You need to find the letter. It's not in the church chest. It's..." A crash in the hallway interrupted him. Theodore's voice sounded closer and closer, and now they could hear the sound of doors being opened violently, room by room. Sandra came back with a laundry worker's uniform and a clipboard. "Put this on him," she instructed quickly. "I'll distract Dr. Alberto. When you hear the fire alarm, run to the service staircase." Magnolia and Olivia helped Raymond put on the uniform over his clothes, while he continued trying to communicate something about the letter. His speech, although clearer than in recent years, was still interrupted and confused. "Church? No," he murmured. "Marindia knows. She was there that night and saw where..." In the hallway, Theodore's voice was now only 2 rooms away. "I want every inch of this floor searched, and call reinforcements for the exits." Sandra went out on her mission of distraction, and seconds later the fire alarm began to sound, its strident noise echoing through the corridors. The confusion was immediate. Doors opening, raised voices, hurried footsteps of staff and patients. Taking advantage of the chaos, the small group began to move towards the supply closet. Raymond, supported between Magnolia and Olivia, made a visible effort to remain steady. Each step seemed like a battle against years of forced lethargy. When they reached the closet, a shout of anger cut through the air. Theodore had seen them. "Olivia!" he roared, his voice overlapping the sound of the alarm. "You traitor! You have no idea what you're doing." Olivia pushed Magnolia and Raymond into the closet, turning to face her brother. "On the contrary, Theodore," she replied, her voice firm. "For the first time in years, I know exactly what I'm doing." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Raymond, as if galvanized by the confrontation, took a step forward. His eyes, now completely lucid, fixed on Theodore. "The blood samples," he said, his voice stronger than at any time since his confinement. "I kept the blood samples of the children, proof of the systematic poisoning. Marindia knows where they are." Theodore's face paled visibly. It was the confirmation of his worst fear. Not only had Raymond recovered his memory, but the physical evidence of his most heinous crimes still existed. "Get them!" he shouted to his men, who were beginning to approach from both sides of the hallway. But it was too late. Magnolia had already located the entrance to the service staircase behind the closet shelves, and the group disappeared through the narrow passage just as the first security guards reached them. The descent down the service staircase was an ordeal. The steps were steep and slippery, lit only by emergency lights. Raymond, despite his weakness, seemed to gain strength with each step, as if the adrenaline and the proximity of freedom were awakening long-dormant resources. "Theodore will block the exits," gasped Magnolia as she helped support Raymond. "Knowing my husband, he must already have men positioned at every door in the basement. That's why we're not going to use the doors," replied Olivia, a small smile forming on her lips. "Sandra told me about the laundry tunnels. They're old maintenance passages that lead to the employee parking lot." When they reached the basement, the sound of the alarm was more muffled, creating a surreal atmosphere. The huge washing machines and dryers cast grotesque shadows on the walls, and the smell of bleach and fabric softener permeated the air. Sandra was waiting for them behind one of the industrial machines. "This way," she whispered, moving a heavy laundry basket that revealed a partially hidden maintenance door. "This tunnel was used to transport heavy equipment before the building was renovated. It will take them directly to the back parking lot." As they prepared to enter the tunnel, Raymond held Olivia's arm. "The letter," he said urgently. "Marindia needs to remember it was with her." That night, at the town library, rare books section. Before they could get more details, the sound of doors being opened violently in the basement alerted them that Theodore's men had arrived. There was no more time for conversation. The group hurried through the dark tunnel, guided only by the light of their cell phones. The path was narrow and damp, with pipes and electrical wires running along the low ceiling. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a gate that overlooked the back parking lot. Joe was waiting for them with the car, the engine running, ready to leave. The back gate was open, thanks to Jane, who had convinced the guard that she needed to pick up urgent medical supplies. As they settled into the car, they could hear Theodore's furious voice echoing through the parking lot. "Find them! They can't have gone far! And call Dr. Alberto. We need an explanation for the patient's disappearance." Joe's car drove off silently, its lights off, sliding through the night like a ghost. In the back seat, Raymond watched the city lights through the window, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. "Town library," he murmured again, as if afraid to forget. "Marindia needs to remember. The letter, the evidence. It's all there." Magnolia, sitting next to him, held his trembling hand, offering the silent comfort that only someone who had also lived under Theodore's yoke could understand. In the front seat, Olivia was already on the phone with her contacts, organizing a safe place to hide Raymond. The night enveloped Willow Creek in its dark cloak, and somewhere in the town, a 6-year-old girl slept, unaware that her father, after 6 long years, was finally free. But the battle was far from over, and the secrets kept in a letter hidden in the town library could change everything. Morning arrived in Willow Creek, bringing a fine and persistent rain, which seemed to mirror the tense atmosphere that hung over the town. At the New Beginnings clinic, Marindia woke up from a restless sleep, her body still fighting the symptoms of withdrawal. The light walls of the private room, provided by Magnolia, seemed to spin gently as she tried to focus her vision. Nurse Mary Lou, a grey-haired lady with a gentle smile, entered the room, carrying a tray with breakfast and medications. There was something in her maternal way that reminded her of the times when Marindia was a teacher, caring for her students with the same kind of dedicated attention. "You had a restless night," commented Mary Lou, helping Marindia to sit up. "You kept calling for Raymond and talking about a library." The nurse's words hit Marindia like an electric shock. Fragments of memory, previously blurred by the fog of alcohol and suffering, began to crystallize in her mind. "The town library," she murmured, her hands trembling as she held the cup of tea. "That night, the last time I saw Raymond." Flashback, 6 years before. It was a cold winter night, and the Willow Creek Town Library was about to close. Marindia, then still a respected teacher, waited anxiously among the shelves in the rare books section. Raymond had set up an urgent meeting, something about important documents that he needed to hide. "I don't trust anywhere anymore," he had said upon arriving, his hands trembling slightly as he held a thick folder and an envelope. "Theodore has eyes everywhere, but here is the last place he would look." "What did you discover that is so dangerous?" she asked, worried about her companion's agitated state. Raymond looked around before answering, his voice little more than a whisper. "It's not just the contamination of the mine. It's much worse. He's using our own milk, Marindia. The milk we produce. He's poisoning people deliberately to study the effects. There's a foreign company involved. Experiments with innocent people." End of flashback. "Ma'am, Mrs. Marindia?" Mary Lou's voice brought her back to the present. "Is everything all right? You suddenly turned pale." Marindia grabbed the nurse's arm with surprising strength. "I need to talk to Joe. It's urgent." On the other side of town, in a small, discreet inn on the outskirts, Raymond rested under the attentive care of Jane. The simple but comfortable room had been arranged by Olivia through trusted contacts. The curtains remained closed, and the only sound was the rain gently beating against the window. "The memories are slowly coming back," he explained to Joe, who had arrived early to visit him. "It's like a fog is dissipating from my mind. 6 years, lost in that institution, drugged until I almost forgot who I was." Joe observed the remarkable changes in his friend. Although still physically debilitated, his eyes had regained the spark of intelligence that characterized him, and his speech became clearer with each passing hour. "We need to find that letter," said Raymond, trying to sit more erect on the bed. "It's not just a letter to Liz. It's the key to everything. Marindia was with me that night. She needs to remember." Joe's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Magnolia. "Theodore is furious. Called an emergency meeting at the company. Something about a surprise inspection by the health department scheduled for today. He knows we're moving." Almost simultaneously, Olivia entered the room, her normally calm face marked by worry. "I received news from the shelter. Someone tried to expedite Liz's adoption process this morning. I managed to block it temporarily, but—" "Theodore," completed Jane, her voice laden with understanding. "He's trying to use Liz as leverage." Raymond tried to get up, his muscles protesting with the effort. "My daughter. I need to see my daughter." "Not yet," said Olivia gently, placing her hand on his shoulder. "We need to do this right, with all the evidence in hand. Theodore is powerful. He has influence in the local judicial system. If we act rashly—" Another cell phone rang. It was Jane's. Her expression changed as she read the message. "It's from the clinic. Marindia is lucid and says she needs to talk to us urgently. Something about the town library." Raymond's eyes lit up. "She remembered! Marindia remembered!" At that moment, a knock on the door made everyone freeze. After a tense moment, they heard the voice of Sandra, the nurse from the asylum. "It's me. I have important news." After checking carefully, they let Sandra in. She was breathless, as if she had been running. "Dr. Alberto disappeared," she informed them, "and all of Raymond's medical records have been deleted from the asylum system. It's as if he was never there." "They're erasing the traces," said Magnolia, who had just arrived. "We need to act fast." Joe grabbed his keys. "I'm going to the clinic to talk to Marindia, if she really remembered where the letter is." "I'll go to the library," decided Olivia. "I know the head librarian. I can get access to the rare books section without raising suspicions. And I need to go back to the mansion," said Magnolia. "Theodore can't suspect my involvement, not yet. I can monitor his movements closely." Jane would stay with Raymond, while Sandra would return to the asylum to keep her eyes open for any suspicious movements. The group separated quickly, each with their specific mission. At the clinic, Marindia was becoming increasingly agitated as the memories returned. The last night with Raymond at the library unfolded in her mind like a film. Flashback. "Where are you going to hide this?" she asked, watching Raymond carefully handle the documents. "In a place that only a literature teacher would know too." "Look for," he replied with a small smile. "Our daughter. When she grows up, she'll understand the clue I left in the letter." He worked methodically, separating the papers between the pages of different old books. The letter to Liz was placed in a special place, inside a specific volume. End of flashback. When Joe arrived at Marindia's room, he found her sitting on the bed, her eyes shining with a clarity she had not shown in years. "The epitaph of a small winner," she said as soon as she saw him. "The first edition of the epitaph of a small winner in the rare book section. Raymond chose this book because—" Her voice failed for a moment, emotionally. "Because it was the book I was reading to him when I found out I was pregnant with Liz." Udin. At the town library, Olivia was already talking with Mrs. Dulcie, the 70-year-old head librarian who knew every volume of her collection as if they were her own children. In the office of the Alcantara mansion, Theodore received increasingly worrying news about the surprise inspection that was approaching. And somewhere in the town, in a room at St. Anthony's shelter, Liz drew quietly, her eyes, so like her father's, focused on her artwork. The drawing showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all holding hands under a smiling sun. The rain continued to fall over Willow Creek, washing the streets and creating a silver curtain that seemed to separate the world into two. The one of appearances that Theodore had built so carefully, and the one of truth that was about to come to light. Somewhere between the yellowed pages of a classic of Brazilian literature, a letter awaited to reveal its secrets and finally bring justice. The Willow Creek Town Library was an imposing neoclassical building with its majestic columns and marble staircase, worn by time. On that rainy morning, the place was practically empty, except for a few students scattered among the study tables and Mrs. Dulcie, the head librarian, who watched with interest as Olivia carefully examined the first edition of the epitaph of a small winner. "Curious," murmured Mrs. Dulcie, adjusting her gold-rimmed glasses. "In the last 6 years, no one has shown interest in this specific volume, and today it's already the second person to ask about it." Olivia froze, her hands hovering over the yellowed pages. "Second person?" "Yes," replied the lady, lowering her voice. "Earlier, a very well-dressed man came specifically after this book. He said he was a collector interested in making a substantial donation to the library." Olivia's heart raced. And where is this man now? "Oh, he left frustrated. You see, I may be an elderly lady, but I'm not foolish. I noticed that there was something strange about the way he handled the book, as if he was looking for something specific between the pages, so I told him that the volume was reserved for restoration." Olivia smiled, admiring the librarian's perspicacity. "And the real book?" Mrs. Dulcie looked around before answering in a whisper. In my office, inside. The safe. In my 45 years working here, I've learned to trust my instincts. And this morning, my instincts told me that I needed to protect this particular book. Meanwhile, at the New Beginnings Clinic, Marindia was having an intense conversation with Joe. Her face, although still marked by fatigue, showed a renewed determination. Raymond was brilliant in his simplicity, she explained, her hands holding a cup of tea that had cooled without being touched. He knew he needed to hide the evidence, where Theodore would never think to look. What better place than a book about betrayal and appearances? Joe absorbed every word, realizing the genius of the plan. The epitaph of a small winner. The story of a man who lets his suspicions destroy everything around him. Almost poetic. But it's not just the letter that's there, continued Marindia, her eyes shining with urgency. Raymond divided the evidence into 3 parts. The first is on the flash drive you found in the church. The second is with the blood samples of the children from Bella Vista, kept in a laboratory in the name of a doctor friend of his. And the third... Her voice was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Mary Lou, the nurse, hurried into the room. "There's a man outside," she whispered, "saying he's from the health department, but something is wrong. He's asking specific questions about the patients in treatment for alcoholism." In the small inn on the outskirts of town, Raymond was having a moment of extraordinary clarity. Sitting on the edge of the bed with Jane by his side, he drew a detailed map of the old mine on a piece of paper. "The scheme was more complex than we imagined," he explained, his hands still trembling, but his strokes surprisingly precise. Theodore wasn't just dumping toxic waste into the water table. He was systematically mapping how different concentrations affected different areas of the town. Jane watched horrified as Raymond marked specific points on the map. The milk distribution routes. They were planned to reach specific neighborhoods. "Exactly," he confirmed, his voice filled with regret. The Bella Vista was the most affected because it was the perfect location for the experiment, a close-knit community, simple people who exclusively consumed Alcantara Company products because they were cheaper. In the office of the mansion, Magnolia faced her own moment of tension. Theodore was on the phone, his voice alternating between veiled threats and attempts at bribery. "I don't care how much it costs," he vociferated. "I want that inspection cancelled, and as for the other matter, double the offer to the family. Interested in adopting the girl. I want that process completed by the end of the week." Magnolia, pretending to organize some papers near the door, felt her blood run cold. Theodore was trying to expedite Liz's adoption, probably to use her as a bargaining chip. Her cell phone vibrated silently. It was a message from Olivia. "We found the letter. It's worse than we imagined. Come to the library as soon as you can." In the rare book section, Mrs. Dulce had just opened the safe in her office. With experienced hands, she carefully removed an aged sheet of paper that was hidden between the pages of the first edition of The Epitaph of a Small Winner. "When I started in this profession," she said, adjusting her glasses again, "I learned that librarians are more than guardians of books. We are guardians of stories, of secrets, of truths. 6 years ago, I saw Mr. Raymond hide something in this book. I realized he was scared, desperate, so when he disappeared..." "You protected the book all these years," completed Olivia emotionally. "And I did more than that," replied Mrs. Dulcie, removing an old key from inside a locked drawer. "Mr. Raymond gave me this, saying it was for a bank deposit box. He said that if something happened to him, I would know the right time to reveal it. At St. Anthony's Shelter," Liz continued her drawings, oblivious to the drama that unfolded around her. The social worker on duty watched the girl with admiration. Despite her difficult history, Liz maintained an extraordinary sweetness and intelligence. "What are you drawing today?" asked the assistant. "My family," replied Liz naturally, "but the real one, not the one they want it to be." Back at the clinic, Joe had managed to alert the administration about the fake inspector, but knew it was only a matter of time until Theodore tried another approach. Marindia, stronger with each hour, insisted on leaving to help in the search for the evidence. "The blood samples," she said, trying to get out of bed. "They're in Dr. Vincente's laboratory at St. Joseph's Hospital." Raymond trusted him. He was the only doctor who agreed to do the tests secretly. At the inn, Raymond completed his map with a series of annotations. Each mark represented an affected family, each number a child who had developed mysterious symptoms. It was a devastating document that revealed the true extent of Theodore's cruelty. "We need to gather everything," he said to Jane. "The letter, the samples, the flash drive, this map. When the health inspection arrives, they need to have access to all the evidence at once." The sky over Willow Creek began to clear, the rain decreasing to a fine drizzle. In the library, Olivia read the letter with trembling hands, each word of Raymond revealing more details of her brother's macabre scheme. It wasn't just a message of love for his daughter. It was a detailed testimony of years of observation and investigation. And in the vault of a local bank, awaiting the key that Mrs. Dulce had kept for 6 years, was the last piece of the puzzle. Original documents proving the connection between Theodore's company and the international conglomerate that funded the experiments with the local population. The afternoon advanced, and with it grew the feeling that all the threads of the story were finally beginning to intertwine. In different parts of the town, people who had been separated by years of lies and manipulation were about to reunite, moved by a common goal: to expose the truth and bring justice. But Theodore Alcantara still had cards to play, and in the coming hours, each person involved in that plot would need to face decisive choices that would test not only their courage, but also their faith in the possibility of justice. The afternoon sun began to slant over Willow Creek when a convoy of 3 black cars parked in front of St. Joseph's Hospital. From the first vehicle, Theodore Alcantara descended, his normally controlled face now marked by a visible tension. Accompanied by 2 men in suits, he quickly crossed the parking lot towards the entrance of the laboratory. At the same moment, in a taxi a few blocks away, Joe and Marindia observed the movement. Against all medical recommendations, she had insisted on leaving the clinic. "It's our only chance," she argued, her eyes shining with a feverish determination. "Dr. Vincente only keeps the samples because I promised him that one day we would come back to get them." Dr. Vincente's laboratory was on the 3rd floor of the hospital, a modest but impeccably organized facility. The doctor, a 65-year-old man with white hair and gentle eyes behind his reading glasses, was cataloging test results when his secretary announced the arrival of important visitors. "Dr. Vincente?" Theodore's voice sounded falsely cordial as he entered the office. "What a pleasure to finally meet you in person." The doctor raised his eyes from his papers, his face remaining deliberately neutral. Throughout 40 years of profession, he had learned to recognize veiled threats in the most polite tone. "Mr. Alcantara," he replied calmly, "to what do I owe the honor?" While this scene unfolded, Joe and Marindia had gained access to the hospital through the service entrance, guided by a young resident who owed Dr. Vincente favors. The plan was simple, but risky. While Theodore was busy in the office, they needed to reach the storage laboratory in the basement. At the town library, Olivia and Mrs. Dulce worked frantically to document every page of Raymond's letter. The text, far beyond a personal message to Liz, revealed itself as a meticulously constructed document that connected all the loose ends of the investigation. "My little Liz," the letter began, "when you read this, I hope you are able to understand why your father needed to do what he did. There are evils in this world that we cannot ignore, even if facing them means great sacrifices." The text continued detailing not only Theodore's criminal activities, but also names, dates, and specific locations where the complementary evidence could be found. It was as if Raymond had created a map of the macabre treasure that revealed the true nature of the experiments carried out with the local population. At the small inn, Raymond had finished compiling his memories in a new notebook, assisted by Jane. Every detail that emerged from the fog of 6 years of chemical confinement was now registered, including the conversations he had heard between Theodore and the representatives of the foreign company. They called it Project Purification, he explained, his voice trembling with indignation. The idea was to test how different compounds affected different populations. Milk was just the vehicle, the perfect means of distribution, because no one would suspect. In the hospital, Theodore continued his seemingly cordial conversation with Dr. Vincente, but his words carried an increasingly evident threatening weight. "Doctor, I heard that you keep a rather extensive file of interesting cases," he said, walking around the office, "particularly some cases from the Bella Vista neighborhood from a few years ago." Dr. Vincente maintained his composure, although his hands tensed slightly on the table. "As a doctor, I keep records of all my patients. It's my professional obligation." In the basement, Joe and Marindia had gained access to the storage laboratory, thanks to a technician who recognized Marindia from the time she taught her daughter. The place was a refrigerated maze of meticulously catalogued samples. "Section C, shelf 17, murmured Marindia, recalling Raymond's instructions. "He said he used a specific code, something that only I would understand." Her eyes scanned the labels until she found a familiar sequence. MCBV 2019 lit. Marindia felt her heart race. They were the initials of Machado de Assis Capitu, Bento Verdade, a reference to the epitaph of a small winner that only she and Raymond shared. At the Alcantara mansion, Magnolia received an important call from her contacts in the health department. The surprise inspection had been rescheduled for the next day, and she knew they needed to act before Theodore could interfere again. Back at the hospital, the tension in Dr. Vincente's office reached its peak. "Doctor," said Theodore, his voice losing the pretense of cordiality, "I'll be direct. I'm willing to make a rather generous donation to your department. In exchange, I just need you to hand me over some specific samples." The elderly doctor rose slowly from his chair, his eyes meeting Theodore's with surprising firmness. "Mr. Alcantara, in over 40 years of medicine, I've learned that there are things that money can't buy. Integrity is one of them." In the basement, Joe and Marindia had located the correct box, but were faced with a new problem. They needed a special key to access the refrigerated compartment. "There has to be a way," whispered Marindia, her body trembling both from the effect of withdrawal and from the anxiety of the moment. That's when they heard footsteps approaching. Instinctively, they hid behind a large storage unit. To their surprise, they saw a familiar face. It was Sandra, the nurse from the asylum, dressed in a hospital lab coat. "Psst," she called softly. "Dr. Vincente sent me. I have the key." In the library, Olivia finished photographing the last page of the letter when she received an alarming message from Magnolia. "Theodore found out about the deposit box at the bank. He's sending people there now." Mrs. Dulcie, who watched everything, with the wisdom of her years of experience, took the key she had kept for so long. "We can't let him get there first," she said with surprising determination for her age. In the laboratory of the hospital, the confrontation between Theodore and Dr. Vincente reached a critical point. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," threatened Theodore, his mask of civility completely abandoned. "On the contrary," replied the doctor calmly, "I understand perfectly, and that's why I took my precautions. All the samples that you're looking for have been duplicated and sent to laboratories in 3 different states. If something happens to me or to the original records..." In the basement, Sandra quickly opened the refrigerated compartment. Inside, in addition to the carefully preserved blood samples, there was something else. An additional flash drive. Raymond thought of everything, explained Marindia, her hands trembling as she held the device. He knew we needed evidence that couldn't be questioned. The blood samples are the physical evidence, but here, she raised the flash drive. Here are the original records of the company, showing exactly how they planned everything. At the inn, Raymond suddenly got up, surprising Jane. "Liz," he said urgently, "we need to get Liz now. Theodore will try to use her as a last resort." And he was right. At that exact moment, at St. Anthony's shelter, a newly arrived social worker presented, apparently official documents, requesting the immediate transfer of Liz to another institution. The sun was beginning to set over Willow Creek, painting the sky with shades of red and gold. It was as if nature itself was signaling that the decisive moment was approaching. In different parts of the town, people who had been separated by years of lies and manipulation were about to converge, each carrying a piece of the puzzle that, when finally assembled, would reveal the true extent of Theodore Alcantara's crimes. The night that approached promised to be the longest of their lives, and no one knew exactly how that story would end. But one thing was certain. There was no turning back. The truth, like a river dammed for too long, was about to break its barriers and flood the town with its unstoppable force. The night had fallen over Willow Creek, bringing with it a fine rain that transformed the city lights into golden blurs. At St. Anthony's shelter, a tense scene unfolded. The social worker who was trying to transfer Liz encountered unexpected resistance in Mrs. Conception, the director of the shelter, a 68-year-old lady who had dedicated her life to protecting vulnerable children. "I'm sorry," said Mrs. Concepcion, her experienced eyes examining the documents presented, "but I cannot authorize this transfer without the presence of Dr. Olivia Mendonça. She is the official person in charge of the case." The social worker, a hard-faced woman who introduced herself as Dr. Regina Matos, insisted with growing irritation. "The documents have all the necessary authorizations. The transfer needs to happen today." "What a coincidence," replied Mrs. Concepcion calmly, "because Dr. Olivia just called me saying she was on her way." Her eyes briefly drifted to Liz, who played quietly in a corner of the room, apparently oblivious to the tension around her. At St. Joseph's Hospital, Joe, Marindia, and Sandra emerged from the basement with the precious samples and the flash drive. Dr. Vincente had managed to keep Theodore busy in his office long enough, a conversation that seemed more like a veiled, verbal duel. "It's not just about the samples, Mr. Alcantara," said the doctor, keeping his voice calm but firm. "It's about all the children from Bella Vista that I've attended over the years. Children who developed mysterious diseases, developmental problems that didn't make sense. Until we started analyzing the pattern." Theodore, his facade of civility increasingly thin, leaned over the doctor's desk. "Doctor, I'm going to make you a last offer. Name your price." "Some things are priceless," replied Dr. Vincente, rising from his chair, "like the ability to sleep at night knowing we did the right thing." At that moment his phone rang. It was Sandra, informing him in code that the mission in the basement had been successful. The doctor allowed himself a small smile as Theodore watched him with growing suspicion. At the town library, Olivia and Mrs. Dulcie had just made digital copies of each page of Raymond's letter. The document, far beyond a personal message, revealed itself as a masterful piece of investigation. "When I started to suspect," Raymond had written, "I thought it was just another case of common corporate corruption, product tampering, tax evasion. But the more I dug, the more horrible it became. The scheme wasn't just about profit, it was about power, about using innocent people as guinea pigs in a diabolical experiment." The letter went on to detail how Theodore's company had partnered with an international conglomerate interested in studying the effects of different chemical compounds on isolated populations. The Bella Vista neighborhood, with its population mostly dependent on the subsidized Products of the Alcantara Company had become the perfect laboratory. That's why, the letter continued, I chose to divide the evidence into parts. Each fragment by itself might seem like just an administrative irregularity, but when united, they reveal the true extent of the horror. At the inn, Raymond had convinced Jane to take him to St. Anthony's shelter. I know my brother, he said, referring to Theodore. He'll try to use Liz as a last resort. That's how he thinks. If he can't control something, he tries to destroy it. At the bank, Magnolia arrived accompanied by her personal lawyer, a man who for years had been secretly helping her build her financial independence. The deposit box that Raymond had rented 6 years before was about to be opened. Mrs. Alcantara, said the bank manager, visibly nervous. We received other people asking about this box today. People insistent. I imagine so, she replied with a serene smile, but only I have the original key, don't I? At St. Anthony's shelter, the situation was about to reach its critical point. Mrs. Concepcion had managed to delay the supposed Dr. Regina for almost an hour, but the woman was getting visibly more aggressive. You don't understand, she said, her tone now openly threatening. This is bigger than you imagine. There are powerful people interested in this transfer. Interesting, replied a voice from the door. It was Olivia, who had just arrived. Because the only people who should be interested in Liz's well-being are those who truly care about her. The fake social worker visibly paled upon recognizing Olivia. At the same instant, Raymond and Jane arrived through the side entrance of the shelter, guided by one of the caregivers who knew the real story. Liz, who until then seemed absorbed in her drawings, raised her eyes upon hearing the movement. Her gaze met Raymond's, and something inexplicable seemed to pass between father and daughter, a recognition that transcended the 6 years of separation. At the hospital, Joe and Marindia had managed to leave with the samples and the flash. A drive, but knew they were just the first steps of a night that promised to be decisive. Theodore, upon realizing that something was wrong, had left Dr. Vincente's office in a state of barely contained fury. He'll try to corner us, said Marindia, her voice weak but determined. Knowing Theodore, he must already have people waiting at every possible exit. That's why we're not going to use the obvious exits, replied Sandra, guiding them through a service corridor. In 20 years working in hospitals, I've learned all the alternative routes. At the bank, Magnolia finally opened the deposit box that Raymond had prepared. Inside, in addition to the expected documents, there was something else. An old cell phone, one of those practically indestructible ones. The last piece, she murmured, understanding. On the phone, preserved for 6 years, were the original recordings of the meetings between Theodore and the representatives of the foreign company. Explicit conversations about the tests, about using the local population as involuntary guinea and pigs. The night advanced, and the rain had intensified. At St. Anthony's shelter, Liz had slowly approached Raymond, her small steps carrying the weight of 6 years of absence. I dreamed about you, she said simply, her childlike voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. Mom always said you were coming back. Raymond, his legs trembling both from emotion and from years of confinement, knelt down to be at his daughter's height. There were no words that could express everything his heart wanted to say. It was at that moment that the lights of the shelter flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, they heard the main door being opened violently. Theodore's voice, laden with a fury he no longer tried to disguise, cut through the darkness. Game over! But what Theodore didn't know was that at that exact moment, each piece of the puzzle that Raymond had meticulously built was finally falling into place. In different parts of the town, people carrying different parts of the truth converged on a single destination. The longest night of Willow Creek was just beginning, And before dawn arrived, long-buried truths would come to light, and lives forever transformed would finally find their way to justice. The darkness in St. Anthony's shelter was broken only by the beams of light from the flashlights that Theodore and his men carried, creating dancing shadows on the walls. In the main room, Raymond instinctively pulled Liz behind him, protecting her with his still debilitated body. Olivia and Mrs. Conception positioned themselves strategically near the other children of the shelter, who had gathered, frightened, in a corner. "Impressive!" Theodore's voice echoed through the room, charged with bitter irony. "All the rats coming out of their hiding places at the same time. Saves me the work." The flashlights moved around the room, momentarily revealing the tense faces of those present. The fake social worker, Dr. Regina, had positioned herself next to Theodore, her expression a mask of malicious satisfaction. "You know, Raymond," continued Theodore, approaching slowly, "you've always been smarter than you seemed, dividing the evidence, creating a complex puzzle. I almost admire your ingenuity. Almost." At the same instant, outside the shelter, Joe, Marindia, and Sandra arrived silently from the back, guided by discreet messages from Jane. They carried with them the samples from the hospital and the devices with the digital evidence. Dr. Vincente followed them, bringing a thick folder with all the medical records he had accumulated over the years. "But you made a fundamental mistake," Theodore's voice continued, now closer. "You thought you could defeat me by playing by the rules, that it was enough to gather evidence, follow legal procedures, as if the system wasn't on my side. From the beginning, it was then that Magnolia appeared through the main, a door, her elegant figure silhouetted against the light of the street. In her hands, she held the old phone found in the bank vault. "Are you sure about that, darling?" Her voice sounded calm and controlled. "Because in the last 2 hours, every recording on this phone has been sent to 5 different newsrooms. Every document, every piece of evidence that Raymond gathered is now in the hands of people you can't control." Theodore turned sharply towards his wife, his composure finally beginning to crack. "You," he hissed, the anger distorting his features. "After everything I gave you?" "Everything you gave me," interrupted Magnolia, her voice gaining strength. "You mean the years of psychological abuse, the veiled threats, or maybe the bruises I learned to hide with expensive makeup?" The children of the shelter watched the scene in tense silence, instinctively drawing closer to each other. Liz, however, remained firm beside her father, her eyes showing an understanding beyond her age. "You don't understand." Theodore tried to regain control of the situation. "Everything I did, every decision, was for progress. Those people in Bella Vista, they were necessary sacrifices for a greater good. Science demands—" "Science, Doctor." Vincente's voice cut through the air as he emerged from the shadows. "You call it science to use innocent children as guinea pigs? To deliberately contaminate an entire population, to study the effects of your poisons?" Marindia, who had entered silently with Joe, couldn't contain a sob upon seeing her daughter. Liz turned to the sound, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mom," she whispered, her small voice carrying years of longing. It was this moment of distraction that Theodore tried to take advantage of. In a quick movement, he pulled something from his coat pocket, not a weapon, but a small remote control. "Do you know what this does?" he asked, a cruel smile forming on his lips. With the press of a button, the entire water distribution system of Bella Vista receives a last, special dose. How many children live there now? 50? 100? The horror of the threat fell like a stone in the room. But before Theodore could continue, a new voice sounded from the entrance. "And that's exactly why I spent the entire afternoon with the water company's engineering team." It was Olivia, and beside her was a middle-aged man wearing the uniform of the sanitation company. "Carlos here," she continued, became quite interested when I showed him the plans that Raymond had kept, detailing the entire parallel system you installed. The system has been completely isolated for 2 hours, informed the engineer. That remote doesn't control anything anymore. Theodore's face transformed into a mask of fury. In a desperate movement, he advanced towards Liz, perhaps thinking of using her as a last resort. But something unexpected happened. Raymond, that man who could barely stand hours before, moved with a force that no one expected. In an instant, he was between his daughter and his former boss. The impact of the encounter sent both to the ground. The lights of the shelter suddenly returned, revealing a scene that no one expected. Theodore Alcantara, the powerful businessman, lying on the floor, his eyes wide, not with pain or anger, but with pure shock. Around him, scattered from the torn pocket of his coat, dozens of small vials rolled across the floor, each labeled with codes that those present already knew well, the same codes found in the blood samples of the children of Bella Vista. "You carried them with you," murmured Magnolia, the understanding dawning on her face. "All these years, you kept samples of the poisons always nearby." "Like a trophy," completed Olivia, the disgust evident in her voice. The sound of sirens began to approach the shelter. They were not police cars, but ambulances and vehicles of the health department. The surprise inspection that Theodore so feared had arrived earlier, and would find much more than administrative irregularities. Liz, breaking the moment of tension, ran into her mother's arms. Marindia, now sober and stronger, knelt down to embrace the daughter she had not seen for so long. Raymond joined them, forming a circle of love and protection that 6 years of separation could not break. Theodore watched the scene with an empty gaze, all his arrogance and power crumbling around him like a house of cards. The fake social worker tried to escape discreetly, but was detained by Jane and Sandra, who blocked the exit. The other children of the shelter, realizing that the danger had passed, began to approach curiously. Mrs. Concepcion organized them with the efficiency of someone who had spent her life caring for little ones. Dr. Vincente was already on the phone with his colleagues at the hospital, organizing emergency exams for all the residents of Bella Vista. The night would be long, but this time for very different reasons. And in the center of everything, a family reconnected, their tears now no longer of pain, but of joy and relief. The truth, for so long submerged in lies and manipulations, finally came to light, bringing with it the promise of justice and redemption. But the story had not yet ended. As the sirens approached and the night began to give way to dawn, the first rays of sun on the horizon promised not only a new day, but a new beginning for all those involved in that plot of secrets and courage. Spring arrived in Willow Creek, bringing with it not only the scent of flowers, but also the promise of new beginnings. 3 months had passed since that fateful night at St. Anthony's shelter, and the town was slowly recovering from the revelations that had shaken its deepest structures. The old mansion that housed the town library, with its imposing columns and high windows, was especially busy on that sunny morning. Mrs. Dulcie, still active at 70, organized the last chairs in the main hall, where a special exhibition would be inaugurated. Memories of Bella Vista, a story of resistance and hope. On the walls, photographs told the story of the neighborhood and its residents. Among them, a special panel showed the smiling faces of the children who, after receiving proper treatment, were finally beginning to recover from the effects of the contamination. Dr. Vincente had personally coordinated the medical team that, in recent months, had worked tirelessly to reverse the damage caused by years of systematic poisoning. "It's amazing how resilient they are," commented the doctor, observing the photographs while helping with the preparations for the exhibition. "Some of the children who presented the most severe symptoms are already running and playing as if nothing had happened. Marindia, who now worked as a volunteer at the library, smiled upon hearing the comment. Her own transformation in recent months was remarkable. The rehabilitation treatment had been successful, and the constant support of her newly reunited family had given her the strength to remain firm in her recovery. "Liz has been my greatest inspiration," she said, adjusting some books on a nearby shelf. "Every time I see her playing in the garden with other children, I remember that all the suffering was worth it." On the other side of the hall, Raymond conversed with Joe while hanging the last posters. His physical recovery had been slow but steady, and although he still carried some sequelae from the years of confinement, his strength of spirit remained unshakable. "You know what's most ironic?" he commented, adjusting a frame that showed the old mine. "The place that Theodore used to cause so much harm is being transformed into something positive. Indeed, after extensive decontamination, the area of the old mine was being transformed into an environmental research center, focused on the study and preservation of the region's water resources. The project, conceived by Olivia and financed, with part of the resources recovered from Theodore's company, promised to bring sustainable development to the community. Magnolia, who had taken over the presidency of the company after the scandal, implemented significant changes in management. The dairy factory underwent a complete restructuring, with new safety and quality protocols being established under constant supervision of regulatory agencies. "Transparency is our new policy," she explained in a recent interview. "Every stage of production is monitored, and the results are public. Never again will anyone use this company to harm our community." Jane continued at the Alcantara mansion, but now as head housekeeper, responsible for transforming the place into a cultural and educational center. The old rooms that once witnessed obscure meetings now housed art and music workshops for underprivileged children. "It's as if the mansion can finally breathe," she commented, observing a group of children from Bella Vista who participated in a painting class in Theodore's former office. Sandra, the nurse who had helped so much on the decisive night, had been promoted to nursing coordinator at St. Joseph's Hospital, where she implemented new care protocols, especially aimed at the Bella Vista community. The exhibition at the library was about to begin, and people from all parts of the town began to arrive. Among them, very well dressed and carrying a folder, was Regina Torres, the former fake social worker who now collaborated with the investigations in exchange for a reduced sentence. "The international connections were deeper than we imagined," she explained to Olivia, who coordinated the task force responsible for dismantling the entire network. Companies on 3 different continents were involved in the experiments. In the center of the hall, a special display case caught the eye. Inside it, protected by glass, was the copy of the epitaph of a small winner that had kept Raymond's secrets for so long. Next to it, a digital screen allowed visitors to virtually flip through the letter he had written to Liz. "For my little Liz," said the text, now part of the town's historical collection. "May you grow up in a world where the truth doesn't need to hide between the pages of books, where justice is not just a beautiful word, but a reality lived by all." Liz, now almost 7 years old, ran among the guests with other children, her laughter echoing through the library hall. Occasionally, she stopped to observe the photographs, recognizing faces and places that were part of her history. "Daddy," she called, pulling on Raymond's shirt sleeve, "tell the story of the secret garden again." It was her favorite part, how Joe, the silent gardener, had kept the clues that helped unravel the entire plot in his garden, among the rose bushes he cultivated with such care. Joe himself, who now directed a project of community gardens in Bella Vista, smiled upon hearing the girl's request. His garden at the Alcantara mansion had been transformed into a therapeutic space where people in recovery, like Marindia, found peace and purpose in the cultivation of flowers and medicinal herbs. When all the guests settled in, Mrs. Dulce went to the small improvised stage to begin the ceremony. Her words, filled with wisdom and emotion, echoed through the hall. A library is not just a repository of books. It is a sanctuary of truths, a refuge where stories, both fictional and real, find their place. Today, we honor not only the courage of those who fought to expose the truth, but also the resilience of a community that, even poisoned, never lost its humanity. As she spoke, Marindia held Raymond's hand with Liz nestled between them. Silent. Tears ran down the faces of many present, not of sadness, but of a deep joy that only realized justice can bring. In the back of the hall, a large banner featured the verses of Machado de Assis, "Truth does not lose by waiting." Below it, a discreet plaque informed that Theodore Alcantara awaited trial in a federal penitentiary, along with several executives of the foreign company that had financed the experiments. The morning sun entered through the high windows of the library, creating golden patterns on the wooden floor. Outside, the town continued its routine, but something had changed fundamentally. The people of Bella Vista walked with their heads held high, aware of their strength and dignity. The children played without fear in the newly built parks, and the older residents shared their stories with pride. Spring in Willow Creek brought more than flowers this year. It brought the certainty that even in the darkest stories, the light of truth always finds its way, and that love, whether it is between parents and children, between friends, or between people who choose to do the right thing even when it is difficult, is the most powerful force of transformation. When the ceremony ended and people began to circulate through the exhibition, Liz took a rose from the nearest arrangement and gave it to her mother. Marindia, emotional, hugged her daughter, while Raymond wrapped them in his arms. "Now yes," said the girl with the wisdom of children, "our story is complete." And it was indeed. Not as an ending, but as a new beginning. A beginning built on foundations of truth, justice, and love. The only foundations truly capable of sustaining the future that all there deserved.